Okay. Well, thank you very much to the organizers of the Mycenaean seminars for your kind invitation. And thank you for your very kind introduction. I think we'll have to agree to disagree. I've only given 3 Mycenaean seminars, and I tend to give one every decade. So probably this is going to be my very last. But at least I can say it's probably the first time that I or any other speaker has addressed the topic that I'm going to tackle today, that is the reception and uses of Minoans and Mycenaeans in a variety of cultural practices, from the visual arts, such as painting and sculpture. Sorry, I have to go back. Can we go back my screen? Okay. Yes, sorry, for one reason we had gone ahead with one of the slides. We have to start with this one. So I was going to say that I was going to focus on a variety of cultural practices, from visual arts, such as painting and sculpture, or the performing arts, such as opera and ballet, literature, fashion, and even comics, as I hope you can see in this slide. Indeed, I hope you can all hear me all right, and you can all see my screen all right. Thank you. Now, the reason I'm going to focus on different cultural practices in which we find modern reimaginations of Minoans and Mycenaeans is because I think that they often show more explicitly and certainly more vividly than scholarly works how the present shapes the kind of Minoans and Mycenaeans we get. And sometimes I think these new different cultural practices even anticipate scholarly trends. And I just want to say that this, before I continue, that this talk has 21 slides. So if you're getting very bored, you can start the countdown. And now I'm going to move to my second slide, because this phenomenon, the phenomenon of incorporating elements from antiquity to create something new, whether it's a comic strip or a new building, is well known and has received different designations according to the particular type of antiquity that serves as an inspiration. Egyptomania, Grecomania, Hellenomania, and Cretomania. And I'm going to use the term Aegeomania as a kind of umbrella term for modern reimaginations of Minoan, Mycenaean, Cycladic, and Western Anatolian antiquities, although today I'm going to focus only on Minoans and Mycenaeans. And I'm going to discuss whether or not every nation has the Minoans and Mycenaeans it deserves and desires, by looking at a number of Aegeomanic works, especially novels, and I shall conclude with some general points about Aegeomania. But before I tackle these themes, I want to say a few words about my title. Many of you will know that this is partly an allusion to the well-known dictum, "Every nation has the government it deserves," by the French political philosopher, diplomat, and great enemy of the French Revolution, Joseph de Maistre. But it is also an allusion to a 1967 article by Jacquetta Hawkes on Stonehenge, an article in which she paraphrased de Maistre in a phrase, and using the phrase, "Every age has the Stonehenge it deserves or desire." And this is a phrase that could be used or could be applied to all kinds of archaeological sites. And what I've done with my title is to paraphrase both, in a sense. And I left the word nation, used by de Maistre, simply because the original dictum is more famous. But I have to say straight away that when it comes to archaeological sites, such as Knossos, or entire cultures and corollary peoples, such as the so-called Minoans and Mycenaeans, I think age and desire trump nation and deservedness all the time. In other words, in the course of my research, and especially when I was writing this book that Yannis kindly mentioned earlier, a book that is very much about Aegeomania and especially Cretomania, I found that although nationality can be a factor in the kind of Minoans, Mycenaeans we get, it is not necessarily one of the most significant ones, at least when it comes to general, broad characterizations of Minoans and Mycenaeans. Let me explain this a bit better. For example, if we look at some characterizations of the Minoans as peaceful, feminine, and decadent, versus warlike, virile, and vigorous Mycenaeans, these characterizations do not seem to be strongly correlated to the nationality of writers and artists, but to specific historical context and broader transnational cultural trends. Now, of course, some specific aspects of Aegeomania can be best appreciated in a national perspective. An example of this could be the reflections on Greekness and the importance of Minoan heritage that we find in works of writers of Cretan descent. Writers such as Nikos Kazantzakis or Rea Galanache. Another example can be found in the reflections on Aegean, Mediterranean, Jewish connections in the works of two Israeli authors, Abraham Yehoshua and Zruya Shalev. And incidentally, these are two authors that I omitted in my book, In Search of the Labyrinth, among many others. And so I thought I would say a bit more about their works in the course of my talk today. So you get something new, not just a recycling of things I've done in my book. And yet, despite the importance of nationality for some specific aspects of Aegeomania, I was struck by how, at a very broad level, similar Minoans and similar Mycenaeans have emerged from the works of writers and artists of very different nationalities, but in specific historical context. And I was also struck by how rather different Minoans and rather different Mycenaeans have emerged from authors of the same nation, and sometimes even from the work of the same author, such as an author is Nikos Kazantzakis, about whom I will say more later. He presents Minoans in different ways at different stages of his life, of his career. So you could say both age and nation have a part to play in the kind of Minoans and Mycenaeans we get, but so also do individual desires, and I would add individual anxieties, which of course can be related once again to age, such as anxieties caused by climate change and modern disasters, like the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster of 2011, which was very much in the mind of the band Giant Squid when they created this album, the 2014 album Minoans, which sees the end of Minoan civilization as caused by the Theran eruption and its aftermaths, tsunamis and so on, which then paved the way to the Mycenaean invasion of Crete, as is narrated through a series of songs in this album. I will now try to illustrate these points about nation, age, desires, and anxieties with more specific examples. And I would like to start with the idea of the Minoans as decadent and the Mycenaeans as vigorous, and also with its opposite, decadent Mycenaeans and Minoans as hippies. And I want to show how this notion seems to be strongly correlated not to nation, but to a particular age. Now, the notion of the Minoans as decadent, Minoan decadence, perhaps may surprise some of you because it is not something that one encounters frequently nowadays for a variety of reasons. First, soon after the rediscovery of Minoan Crete in the first decade of the 20th century, thanks to Evans and also thanks to many other scholars, it is the Mycenaeans who were often seen as decadent, that is, as a late, derivative, degenerate manifestation of Minoan culture. And actually, this is an idea, as many of you know, that has lingered in Aegean studies for quite a while. But second, in our times, the Minoans are usually seen more like lovable hippies. As remarked well over a decade ago by Mary Beard, who also dubbed, tongue-in-cheek, the Minoan lilies as the ancient equivalent of flower power. In other words, nowadays, the Minoans are usually seen as a model society that offers a blueprint for our future, especially when their alleged pacifism and gender equality are seen in a positive light. Whereas the Mycenaeans are often presented as violent, patriarchal, party poopers who spoiled the celebration of the long Minoan summer of love. And yet, for many authors and artists of the interwar period and also of the 1940s, the Minoans came to symbolize a spent force, a decadent civilization, whereas the Mycenaeans came to symbolize vitality and the future. And the elements that helped partly to illustrate the Minoan decadence versus Mycenaean vigor were often perceived in binary terms as follows and in no particular order. Over-refinement versus healthy barbarism, alleged pacifism versus militarism, sexual extravagance versus sexual restraint, and last but not least, racial affiliations, Minoans as non-Aryan versus Aryan Mycenaeans. And incidentally, this slide showing this painting created by an Australian artist, Norman Lindsay, would have done very nicely as a dust jacket for some of the novels that show the Minoans as decadents, which I'm about to discuss. So, an historical novel that illustrates some of these points is Gudjan og Oxen, which means the goddess and the bull, or the goddess and the ox, by the Icelandic author Kristmann Gudmundsson. In this novel, published in 1937, the author describes in a fairly positive way the liberal sexual mores of the Minoans, but he also describes the Minoans as a gentle and decadent race, bred in a humane, civilized atmosphere, but most importantly, also as a people whose peaceful liberalism and over-refinement allowed the rise of extremist factions. And this situation has made the Minoans vulnerable to military attacks from more vigorous, hard-nosed northern tribes, the Mycenaeans, who are equated with Homer's Achaeans. And indeed, in the final pages of the novel, the Mycenaeans are described as rising in might and splendor and representing the future. Nikos Kazantzakis also offers another example of decadent Minoans and vigorous Mycenaean Greeks in several of his works, Indeed, as Roderick Beaton has shown in a series of essays on Minoans in modern Greek literature, Kazantzakis is an author whose views of Minoan, Mycenaean, Hellenic relations have evolved over time, and therefore Kazantzakis illustrates once again how age trumps nationality in some respects. Here, I shall simply mention that the first work by Kazantzakis in which the Minoans appear as a rather bad lot is his 1938 epic poem, The Odyssey, a Modern Sequel, which presents the incestuous, depraved, and oppressive Minoan Cnossian elite as a prefiguration of the decadent contemporary Western bourgeoisie. Really, his description of the fall of Knossos reminds one of the Bolsheviks' storming of the Winter Palace. And I think, incidentally, that this portrayal of the fall of Knossos as the Bolshevik storming of the Winter Palace seems to me to anticipate Marxist interpretations of the fall of the Aegean palatial system by at least a couple of decades, 2 or 3 decades. Now, my third example of decadent Minoans of the interwar period is the 1925 novel, historical novel, The Birth of the Gods, by the Russian author Dmitry Merezhkovsky, a seminal figure of the Russian Silver Age. Although this novel doesn't really deal very much with the Mycenaeans, it does present the Minoans, as you can see in this slide, as charming devils. Charming, but devils all the same. They are ruled by a sick-looking king, who is also a queen, who has committed matricide and is devoted to human sacrifice. And in this work, Knossos is a hotbed of intrigue. It's a palace populated by a remarkable array of eunuchs, transvestite priestesses and priests, sexually forward women, as well as androgynous youths who are experimenting with their homosexuality and also with voyeurism. And incidentally, I think besides showing the Minoan as decadent, this work is also interesting because it anticipates later scholarly observations about aspects of Minoan iconography, such as a focus on movement and on gender ambiguity. And this is also one of the earliest works that I can think of that presents the decadence of Minoan society as partly due to a shift from matriarchy to patriarchy, but as an internal shift, not something brought by the Mycenaeans. Now, I could discuss many other examples of decadent Minoans versus vigorous Mycenaeans that you can find in works of the interwar period or works of the 1940s. But I'm afraid the 3 works I discussed so far will have to suffice. Instead, what I'm going to do now is try and explain why this view of the Minoans and Mycenaeans seems to cluster around these decades. And this is water, not rachi. Now, I think that the main reason why the works by Merezhkovsky, Gudmundsson, and Kazantzakis, among others, portray the Minoans as decadent and the Mycenaeans as vigorous is that they partly betray a transnational, especially European, preoccupation with decadence that was typical of the fin de siècle, but continued and indeed resurged after the Great War. After the Great War, many became more conscious of and anxious about the perils of decadence, which was seen in some quarters as stemming from a variety of factors that included over-refinement, excessive liberalism, bourgeois values, capitalism, the emergence of pacifist movements such as the Socialist Second International, and so on. And we can find illustrations of some of these points in universal histories of this period, such as Spengler's The Decline of the West and H.G. Wells' An Outline of History, which are now completely forgotten works, but they were bestsellers at the time. Indeed, I should like to say that in the case of H.G. Wells, we find the preoccupation with decadence already in some of his most famous works, such as the novels The Time Machine and The War of the Worlds, which were published before 1900. But to go back to Wells and Spengler's universal histories, these are works that not only deal with decadent Minoans and vigorous Mycenaeans, but also influenced the novels, the authors I discussed earlier, and many, many others, of course. And this preoccupation with decadence in the interwar period, as I've already hinted above, is also accompanied by an increasing admiration for healthy, barbaric Aryan people. And these are the very words used by Wells in his outline of history to underscore that the over-refined Minoans deserved to be conquered by the Greeks, since the Minoans were not usually considered as Aryans, whereas the Bronze Age inhabitants of Greece were usually identified with Homer's Achaeans. For Spengler, too, Minoan Crete is decadent. And while often for other authors, Minoan Crete starts to become decadent in the second half of the second millennium BC, for Spengler, the Minoans are completely hopeless. Already by the time of the Camarist period, already by the time of the first palaces, Minoan Crete is redolent with late Roman luxury. Its material culture is clever but empty, and of course, it's too Oriental. And by contrast, the Mycenaeans, it's as if Spengler's Mycenaeans are blessed with the bearish morning vigor of the German lands. Now, also the idea of Minoan pacifism versus Mycenaean militarism was also beginning to take a hold among scholars and lay people alike. And as mentioned earlier, in this interwar period, many saw pacifism in a negative light. Look at this sentence as this phrase given by Spengler in an interview of 1936. When whole peoples become pacifistic, it is a symptom of senility. Strong and unspent races are not pacifistics. And it was, of course, this kind of rhetoric that was prevailing in the interwar period and eventually led to the Second World War. Not surprisingly, Minoan pacifism versus Mycenaean militarism swapped their respective negative and positive connotations only in the late 1950s, and also became more closely linked with the alleged Minoan proto-feminism and Mycenaean patriarchy. But once again, nationality does not seem to be a major factor, because we find these ideas in works of scholars, artists, and authors of different nationalities, as the few examples in this slide are going to illustrate. The last two, Brigitte Riebe, Palast der Blauen Delfine, and Judith Hahn's Voice of the Goddess, are two historical novels that look at conflicts between Minoans and Mycenaeans, in which the Minoans are seen as pacifists in a positive light, and Mycenaean militarism is not seen in a positive light. Well, Judy Chicago's Dinner Party is an installation that critics have hailed as the most famous feminist artwork of all time. As you can see in this slide, it comprises a large ceremonial banquet arranged on a triangular table with a total of 39 place settings, each commemorating an important woman, real or divine, from prehistory to modern times. For example, we have a representation of the goddess Ishtar. One place is for Queen Elizabeth I, and one is for Virginia Woolf. And one of the 39 place settings is dedicated to the Cnossian snake goddess, in homage to the idea of Minoan Crete as one of the peaceful matriarchal cultures worshipping a supreme female deity, and later overrun by patriarchal hordes, as one can gather from the explanatory panels that accompany the installation. Now, I want to move on, and the rest of my talk, to give you some examples of the role that nationality can play in Aegeomania. And as I said earlier, nationality is obviously significant if one's starting point is the very study of the relationship between Minoan heritage and Greekness that you can find in works by Greek writers of Cretan descent, such as Kazantzakis, Odysseus Elitis, Aris Dictaeus, and Rea Galanaci. It is, after all, their dual Cretan and Hellenic identity that prompts this author's reflections in the first place. And yet, as Roderick Beaton's careful analysis of Kazantzakis' Minoans and Mycenaeans has shown, they changed through times, and this suggests to me once again that age and individual concerns are perhaps more significant than nationality. As shown by Beaton, Kazantzakis' Minoans change from the antithesis of Hellenism to contributors to Hellenism. The Minoans are the antithesis of Hellenism, not only in the Odyssey, but also in other works produced by Kazantzakis in the 1940s, such as Kouros, the drama Kouros, which is a reimagination of the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur, in which the Hellenic triumphs over the non-Hellenic, and in which the non-Hellenic is represented by something monstrous, the Minotaur. And so the Minoans are something monstrous that has to be defeated, has to be conquered. But then the Minoans turn into good guys and contributors to Hellenism in a much later work, the last work, report, the kind of autobiography of Kazantzakis, Report to Greco, and they turn into contributors to Hellenism because, according to Kazantzakis, they allowed the soul of Greece to accomplish its destined mission, that was to reduce God to the scale of man. It makes a parallel between the small-sized human divinities of the Minoans and compare them to the monstrous, immovable statues of Egypt and Assyria. And although according to Kazantzakis, of Report to Greco, the Minoans, created a new humanity full of agility and grace that was still different from that of Greece. At least it was a first step towards a kind of Greek and European humanism. These ideas are not particularly original, but we can find similar ideas in plenty of other works published since the early 20th century. But what is interesting in the context of my talk now is that it shows that it's a change of perception in Kazantzakis himself. So again, showing that nationality is not necessarily so important when it comes to certain type of characterizations of Minoans and Mycenaeans. Now, continuing the theme of nationality and Aegeomania, I wish to discuss briefly the work of two Israeli authors I mentioned earlier, Yehoshua and Shalev, which I was not able to include in my publication In Search of the Labyrinth. And here, once again, we find that some elements in their narratives are closely related to nationality. And this is because these authors make connections between the Aegean Bronze Age and significant episodes in the history of the Jews. Yet, at the same time, the uses and characterizations of Minoans and Mycenaeans emerging from the pages of their novels is quite different. In Mr. Money, published in Hebrew in 1989, Yehoshua talks about Minoan Crete in a chapter that discusses an important crossroad in Jewish history, the Second World War and Shoah. And these in the book are represented by the Battle of Crete and its aftermath. And in this novel, Yehoshua uses Minoan Crete, ironically, as the origins of Europe and a kind of a blissful opposite to World War II. It's the opposite of the present, peaceful and so on. And in the author's own words, Hitler sent his best sons to bleed to death on this distant rocky island simply to let Europe know that his long arm could reach the roots it grew from. So Minoan Crete is a blissful, ancient blissful civilization that had lived without guilt or fear, safely ensconced in unfortified palaces. And it was blissful not only because it's apparent peace, but also because Jewishness had not yet been invented. So in a sense, you could say that for Yehoshua, Minoan Crete, its alleged pacifism and are simply cues to reflect upon a number of issues concerning different identities, Jewish, German, Arab, Mediterranean, and European. Shalev's Thera, published in Hebrew in 2005, the Aegean Bronze Age is linked to Jewish history through the idea that the Bronze Age eruption of Santorini triggered the exodus from Egypt, an idea that has exercised cranks, but also very serious scholars alike for decades since the 1960s. But above all, Shalev uses the Theran eruption and its aftermath as metaphors of more personal history and more personal disasters. First of all, the divorce of the novel's main character, an archaeologist who happens to look exactly like the famous fresco known as La Parisienne, which with a lot of poetic license in the novel is located, it's a fresco located in a palace on Akrotiri, on Thera, rather than the palace at Knossos. But Shalev also reflects on how major disasters such as the eruption of Thera, affect individual people who are traumatized, displaced, and whose familiar worlds and all certainties collapse. And this idea links with the last work that I wish to discuss today. And this is Beautiful World, Where Are You? By the Irish author Sally Rooney, which was published in 2021. And Rooney's novel is about love among people in their late 20s and early 30s, at a time when they feel that the world is on the brink of a major crisis and system collapse. A system collapse that Rooney compares with the late Bronze Age collapse of civilization. Among the symptoms of the modern crisis are major unpredictable shifts in electoral politics, from the election of Donald Trump to Boris Johnson, you name it, to mass drowning of refugees and, of course, climate change. Little do the characters of the novel know, at least at the beginning of the story, that their world is actually on the brink of the COVID-19 pandemic, although the reader obviously knows this, and the novel does, in fact, end in the middle of the first lockdown in Ireland. Now, in connection with system collapse, Linear B, Arthur Evans, Michael Ventris, John Chadwick, and Ina and Alice Kober make cameo appearances, and Rooney uses the late Bronze Age collapse of civilization also especially to muse on the effects of collapses, not on the elites, but on poor people, and she seems to conclude that these collapses seem to have had very, very little effect, were actually fairly negligible for poor people. For them, life continues as usual. And so she also uses this, the Bronze Age collapse to muse more broadly on the meaning of life, which she concludes is to accept that it is not eternal progress, that powerful technologies and developments of complex cultural forms are like tides that come and go, while the real meaning of life is just to live and be with other people. And I'm sure that the idea that what is important is to live and to be with other people will resonate with many, especially after COVID-19, and especially for people who have lost loved ones in this period. But I think also one of the things that this pandemic has actually shown us is that crises and collapses may have more effect on poorer people, on poorer countries. So perhaps Rooney's novel is in fact a missed opportunity to meditate not just on similarities, but also differences between different collapses in different ages. But I think it is still interesting that she found some inspiration from the Aegean Bronze Age, from the disappearance of Linear B, and so on, and made these things relevant to her own present. Now, it is time that I brought my talk towards its end, and I draw some conclusions. I hope the examples I have discussed today are sufficient to illustrate the idea that, on the whole, age and desires and anxieties trump nation and deservedness when it comes to Minoans and Mycenaeans. And if I were a betting woman, which I'm afraid I'm not, I would wager that future Aegeomanic works might involve some form of plague as part of the explanation for the fall of the Minoan and Mycenaean palaces and the collapse of civilization at the end of the Bronze Age. But above all, I wish to conclude with a few words as to why archaeologists and ancient historians might wish to pay some attention to Aegeomania. Basically, I want to reflect on how can art and literature help us to understand what happened in the past and its relevance to the present. And I hope this might stimulate some discussion. First, I would like to say that it is not always easy to distinguish between what happened in the past and the history of scholarship. And I would say that Aegeomania can be seen as part of the history of scholarship because there are interesting dynamics between scholarly works and Aegeomanic works. In the course of my research, I found that at times writers and artists seem to have simply reaffirmed dominant scholarly narratives and orthodoxies about Minoans and Mycenaeans, but at other times they have modified or even questioned them in ways that intersect and sometimes seem to me even to anticipate scholarly debates, whether these are Marxist interpretations of the fall of the Aegean palaces or observations on gender representations in Aegean iconography and its significance. And I believe that some Aegeomanic works, some novels about Minoans and Mycenaeans, historical novels of Minoans and Mycenaeans, also stimulated, influenced the archaeological career of some very distinguished practitioners. Second, I think that as specialists, we ignore at our peril how different media help to disseminate our subject to wider audiences, because it is often these media that give our subject a new vitality and relevance to the present. People may disagree with what I'm about to say, but sometimes I feel that we have become so specialized that we have lost some of Sir Arthur Evans's knack for making the past relevant to the present. And this relevance can be found, though at times, in Aegeomanic rather than in our scholarly works. And third, I found that modern reimaginations of the Minoans and of the Mycenaeans can be good to think with. Like specialist works, modern uses, modern responses to the Minoan past are subjective and historically contingent. But also, these responses are not entirely arbitrary. They all relate to specific features of Minoan and Mycenaean culture, whether it's the exposed breasts in female imagery or androgynous representations of the human body or something else. And this can stimulate different ways of seeing the Aegean Bronze Age. And I think this is partly because, as Paul Klee, another artist who used Aegean Bronze Age elements in his work, once reminded us, art does not reproduce the visible. Rather, it makes visible. Thank you for your patience.